So I was at a meeting earlier this week, and there was a speaker. Actually, it was through the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, and it was, if some of you may remember, we had Belle Yoeli speak to our congregation a year ago or so, and they invited Belle to join us by Zoom. She was giving an update on one of her areas of expertise is the constantly changing situation in Israel. So for probably many of you are familiar with this, but a lot of times when we'll be talking to people about Israel in the last, 20 years, we might say, well, how's the situation in Israel? Well, the moderator started by saying, I can't say how's the situation in Israel, I have to say how are the situations. And then I have to explain which situation I'm talking about, because there's so many things going on in Israel right now that if I just asked you, Belle, tell us how things are going in Israel or what's the situation, you wouldn't know how to respond. So it used to refer just to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, just. Today it could refer to, you may have read in the news, Iran and Saudi Arabia formed an agreement with the help of China. Netanyahu has his own legal troubles, and any number of his cabinet members have even worse legal troubles. There's almost every day, it seems, there's another article about some sort of challenge in his cabinet. We've seen elections in Israel. I didn't look up how often, but it seems like it's almost annually now that we get new elections, which means that it's really a sign of the way in which, much like America today, the Israeli public is so polarized that their coalition government can't stay together, right? That the people say, nope, we've got to elect a new leader. You can imagine in America the same thing would happen. We tend to talk about approval ratings. If you imagine every time the approval rating of our leading government officials went below 50%, we had a new election, we'd be having elections every 2 months, right? But what most people are talking about today when they talk about the situation is a series of laws that are being proposed and in the process of being passed that particularly have to do with the role of the Supreme Court. Israel's government in some ways is set up in a less complex way than ours, or at least with fewer checks and balances. So the way I think about it is they have the executive branch and they have the judicial branch. They don't have Congress to oversee the two. So you don't have 3 legs on the stool, you have 2. Over the last 20, 30 years, the judicial branch has become very, very powerful, and they've struck down a number of laws that the executive branch has put forth. And now the executive branch is pushing back pretty strongly, and some of the laws that they propose it's complicated, and I'm happy to share resources. I'm hoping to do that in the coming weeks that'll let you dive deep into it if you like to dive deep into these things. But loosely speaking, the challenge is that in weakening the judicial branch of government, that the political branch, the executive branch as we would call it, would be able to override a decision made by the courts. Imagine in our system what we would say is, imagine that the President of the United States and his or her one day cabinet could overrule the Supreme Court. That's my best understanding in the simplest form as to what the challenge is. And there have been a number of red flags that have been thrown up by, one of the great current Israeli intellectuals, Yuval Noah Harari, who's a professor at Hebrew University. He's written a number of great books. One is called Sapiens, the other is called Homo Deus. They're great books. We've studied them in Torah study. He's a great Israeli scholar. He wrote in an article in the Washington Post this week, he said, I've had many opportunities to leave Israel for my scholarship. I've never considered leaving Israel to live somewhere else, but now, because of what's happening, I worry that in the future, something I write might cause me to be expelled. I might want to live somewhere else. There were a number, this made the news relatively prominently, a number of the Israeli Air Force reservists refused to go into service, in part out of protest and in part because they wanted to go to the protests in which hundreds of thousands of people are marching in the streets. Culturally, the Israeli Air Force is the premier elite force within Israel's military. It would be, in my opinion, like Americans saying 5-star generals decided not to show up for work out of protest. These are people revered for what they do. There are plenty who disagree with them. It's not as though it's one-sided. So when I think about this, and I think about our Torah portion, I think about those two groups. Because I ask, where are we supposed to be? We're far away, and I know many times I've said things about Israel to Israelis, to friends, and they say, look, you don't live there. It's different. If you don't live there, you can't really understand what's going on, and you can't criticize from afar. But I think in that sense, the Torah portion gives us a good metaphor. There are people who are not involved in the building of Israel, who aren't involved in voting for Israel, Israeli politicians who aren't paying Israeli taxes, but who give of our own free will and of our heart and our love for the state of Israel. And then there are those who are doing the work. So we have to trust them, but that doesn't mean that we back off. And we certainly don't back off just because we don't like what's happening. So I was trying to think, how do we understand our commitment? Israel this year is turning 75. So I looked back. This is a good history test. Anybody really strong in history? This will be a good test. Anybody remember what the Compromise of 1850 was? No? I had the benefit of Google, so that was... You remember? Yeah? No, say it. You get extra points. Yom Kippur points. You get to go to the bathroom twice during the service. Good. So, Harvey's right. Winner. Impressive. I'll call Harvey now instead of Googling things. So the Compromise of 1850. So the reason I found this was I just wanted to know, where was America when we were age 75? Israel's at the age, they're 75. So where were we? Compromise of 1850 did three important things. One, it welcomed the state of California as a free state, meaning a state that did not accept slavery. Okay? Sounds good, right? Second, reason why it's called a compromise, it enacted the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that in a state that was free, if there was a slave who had escaped, that slave had to be returned to their owner in a slave state. And third, it said that you could not trade slaves in the District of Columbia, even though you could still have slaves in the District of Columbia. You just couldn't sell them. My point in saying it is, it's interesting to compare. We say, at age 74, because we weren't quite 75 yet, at age, really 74 and a half, if you want to be specific, at age 74 and a half in our country, we were welcoming states that were free, and we were empowering states to get their slaves back who had slavery. That's where we were at 74. So where is Israel today, and how can we be a country, brethren and friends, who can maybe offer our wisdom to say to them, we know where you are in some ways, but we also know where you're going, because 11 years later, Harvey, what? What's 11 years after? The Civil War starts. See, I don't have to ask Google anymore. So here's what we know. We know that when we made the compromise at age 74, that at age 85, we were in a civil war. We know what happens when the community and the country are divided in such a way that they can't come together, and it wasn't good. So one way to engage is to care, because we don't want you to go down that path. The second is to offer our own commitment to stay close. It's something we've talked about a lot before in a lot of different contexts. I'll share briefly. Some of you who were at the Interfaith Justice series on Wednesday night heard this story. It was shared by an Akron police officer. He shared it in a different context, but I think it fits. He shared that he had gone to Europe a few years ago, and he had a run-in with the police there. He didn't do anything wrong. He lost his keys. But anyway, the police were called, and he noticed he was talking to the police officers, and he said, look, I'm a police officer back in America. And their comment immediately was, that's the wild, wild west over there. That's crazy. I can't believe you choose to be a police officer in a place that has so many violent deaths. Now, I don't think, even though we can talk about all the facts and the way in which America might fit that description, I don't think that's how we feel living in our homes every day. In other words, I talked to my friend who just finished a sabbatical. He was in Israel for 3 months. And I said, what was it like? I've heard there's hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets. The Air Force pilots are leaving their jobs and they're going to these rallies, and you see all these pictures. He said, Josh, if you didn't go show up at the rally, you wouldn't know it was happening. In other words, life is going on as normal. In Israel, people are doing what they normally do. Just like in Akron, you could look up the statistics on how many people have been shot in the last month in our city, and all of us would say it didn't stop me from doing anything I was already doing. So we can look at it from afar and say things are terrible, but if we were living there, chances are we'd say life is going on as if it's normal. This is a problem, but let's not paint the whole picture as though the whole place is in uprising and the state's not going to last another month. And finally, can we look towards, as I mentioned at Shalom Rav, the aspirational goals of the state? So perhaps this is a different question. If we're thinking of the Torah portion and we say, well, we are going to be the givers, the people who don't give up. We're going to keep giving until somebody yells at us and says, stop giving us your commitment or your money, or stop coming over here. You guys are bothering us too much. We can't handle all the ways in which you are helping us out. At what point would that happen? And I think the best document and the strongest Zionist document that we have, unfortunately, there's no constitution in the state of Israel, not yet. But in the Declaration of Independence, they were very intentional about what they saw for what they wanted the state to be. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's not short. But here are two, I think, wonderful passages from the Declaration of Independence. The state of Israel will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. This is in 1948. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Therefore, we appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Israel in the tasks of immigration and building up our land, and we promise to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. There are a lot of things that we're going to have to struggle through in the coming months. There are challenging situations. There are politics in Israel that will threaten to divide us in ways. But we have a long tradition of working hard, of making immense sacrifices, of doing more and more and more work until somebody yells at us to stop because we finally have run through the finish line and are way beyond it, and we aren't there yet. So I pray that we can be so diligent in this work. I invite all of you to join us on our Israel trip next year for precisely that reason, in all seriousness. If you're able, one of the great ways to be close to what's going on, to understand it, to show commitment, is to be there and to bring that sense home. But for most of us, that's not realistic. So I encourage you to carve out time, to learn about what's going on, to read the articles, to come to the dialogue we're having Tuesday night at the JCC with all three rabbis, to our speaker on Wednesday, who's an Israeli author. We have a men's group coming up, I was reminded today as I had to look at the calendar, in April, where we're going to go through this wonderful article that was written by Rabbi Daniel Hartman about the way in which American Jews are self-selecting in our relationship to the Jewish state. We have to keep giving of ourselves, even when we disagree and are frustrated, until somebody says to us, looking at the Declaration of Independence, Dainu, we've reached it. It's enough. Things are so good here, we don't need your help anymore. Just come sit on our beaches. But we aren't there yet. So I pray that that day will come in our lifetime, and I pray that we'll be part of the solution. Shabbat shalom.